Good afternoon, everybody. Come on in and grab a seat. Welcome back. I hope everybody enjoyed a nourishing lunch break, both physically and intellectually, with some of our lunch speakers. Now, to kick off our afternoon plenary session, we'll be having two more keynote addresses. First up, I'd like to welcome the Honorable Christopher Krebs, who is the director of the newly renamed Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency at the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, otherwise known as CISA. Mr. Krebs was originally sworn in as the Undersecretary for the predecessor of CISA, the National Protection and Programs Directorate. Now, as the director of CISA, Mr. Krebs oversees CISA's efforts to defend civil networks, secure federal facilities, manage systemic risk to national critical functions, and work with stakeholders to raise the security baseline of the nation's cyber and physical infrastructure. Before serving as CISA's director, Mr. Krebs was appointed in August of 2017 as the Assistant Secretary for Infrastructure Protection, having joined DHS in March of 2017 as Senior Counsel to the Secretary. Before joining DHS, he was a member of Microsoft's U.S. Government Affairs team as the Director for Cybersecurity Policy, where he led Microsoft's U.S. policy work on cybersecurity and technology issues. I'd like to just remind you all that after Chris Krebs speaks, he will be taking questions from the audience. So if you could begin to think of some questions that you may like to ask him. And when you come up to the microphones, if you could please keep it short, identify yourself and ask your questions, I'd really appreciate it so we can stay on time. So I'd like to welcome the Honorable Christopher Krebs to the podium now.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you. It really is an honor to be here today for multiple reasons. One, I've had the pleasure of working with Catherine and the Atlantic Council team for many years, so to actually be able to come up here and give a keynote is a great honor, both professionally and personally based on relationships. But it's also an honor because I'm stepping in for Secretary Nielsen, who was also always a big supporter of the Atlantic Council and Catherine in this effort. So to be able to come up here and represent her, such a big believer in international cooperation, cybersecurity, I hope I can do half the job that she was able to do. So what I kind of want to talk about today is where things are in terms of the Homeland Security space and how my team, the agency and CISA, is evolving to address emerging threats, but really how the landscape has changed and how we have changed in response. So the Cyber and Infrastructure Security Agency was established in November of 2018. Prior to that, as Catherine said, it was the National Protection and Programs Directorate. As I've described it, it was a bit of an island of misfit toys. Took various security and protection focused parts of the department and crammed them together because they frankly didn't fit in FEMA or TSA or CBP or elsewhere. So it was almost a holding spot. But that was 2003, 2007, 2009. When the department was established in 2003, 16 years ago, it was established in response to a terrorist-focused threat. Frankly, nation-state threats, nation-state adversaries were not top of mind. They were not driving investment decisions on the Hill. They were not driving policy conversations in the National Security Council. But over the last 16 years, there's no question that understanding, that appreciation of what the world looks like has shifted dramatically. And it's not just that nation states have gotten more competent, more capable, more brazen in some cases, but it's also due to the fact that we've changed the way or evolved the way, expanded the ways we interact with technology. Not a day goes by where somebody doesn't find some new and questionable way of using technology, connecting to the internet, sharing personal information. So it's up to us to think through what are the implications and how do we manage risk that's only growing on a daily basis. So as time passed, the investments changed, and Congress recognized, not with a little bit of prodding, but a lot of prodding, from not just the Trump administration, but the prior administration, the Obama administration, that the federal government needs a clearly recognized single point of entry, single point of coordination for critical infrastructure, cybersecurity, risk management. So, enter the Cyber and Infrastructure Security Agency. Now, when I talk about how I view the agency and how we work with industry and how we work with state and local partners in the federal government, it's not that we're the nation's risk manager, because at the end of the day, I'm not pushing buttons or turning dials to manage risk. To put it, I think, a little bit more accurately, we're the nation's risk advisor. We work with our partners in the intelligence community and the law enforcement community and the international community to understand what the threat landscape looks like. But it's more than just understanding what the threat looks like, it's understanding what it means, putting it in context, understanding how it would impact the critical infrastructure community. So it's about understanding what's going on out there, what the adversary is doing, but contextualizing that risk in a network perspective, giving the blue team, the network defenders, the advantages they need to be able to act, to be able to protect their networks, to put them in a position to be successful. So to do this, I think we have to step back a little bit and look at what the adversary space looks like. So this has kind of evolved over time, but increasingly thinking about a 2+3 framework. The most active nation-state adversaries right now are Russia and China, and then we also have Iran, North Korea, and then the extremist space. Those adversaries that are developing capabilities and maybe more regionally focused, but are showing all the signs and all the potential of evolving into a truly cyber-capable adversary. So this 2+3 framework, think about everything we've done, whether it's my team and the US CERT team issuing advisories over the last 2 years. For Russia, we've issued a number of technical alerts, indicators of compromise, launched a number of webinars and other advisory capabilities to share our understanding of what the bad guys are doing. Whether it was the Grizzly Step campaign after the 2016 election interference, and you better believe I'm going to come back to that today, but it's also joining with the United Kingdom's National Cybersecurity Center in issuing a joint bulletin alongside the FBI on network infrastructure device compromise at a global scale. But we've also seen Russia attempt to compromise energy infrastructure. How? By exploiting trusted relationships with the supply chain and vendors. Better believe I'm going to come back to that today. In terms of China, we've also seen, most recently in December rather, the Department of Justice indict a number of Chinese cyber actors for a global scale campaign compromising managed service providers and cloud service providers. And what this represents more than anything to us is that the adversary is getting much more efficient, much more effective in the way that they target critical infrastructure. There was a great panel earlier on norms of behavior. Intellectual property theft for commercial gain remains off limits. So what we're seeing is rather than the Chinese actors going directly at individual companies, they're going to the points of aggregation. They understand the business decisions and the business processes domestically here in our infrastructure, but not just in the US, but in Europe and elsewhere, that more and more companies are looking to save money, be more efficient, and be more productive, and so they're going to these managed service providers, which provides the adversary or the actor a much more efficient way of getting to the stuff they want to get. And that's the intellectual property, that's PII, so on and so forth. In terms of Iran, we've issued reports on the Mabna Institute and some of their password spraying attacks. In Korea, I could stand up here for hours and talk about North Korean activity, particularly when it comes to financially motivated activities. But under the Hidden Cobra campaign, we've issued a number of indicators of compromise on what is a persistently active adversary. So as the adversary space continues to expand and grow, the good news is the international partnership space continues to grow. Over the last several years, we've only increased our engagements with foreign partners. Just recently, my agency, the Cyber and Infrastructure Security Agency, deployed an analyst to London to embed with the NCSC, with the National Cyber Security Center. That's a model that we're going to continue to grow with international partners so that we can coordinate on joint action and we can coordinate on joint bulletins at a very minimum. But it's also a day-to-day engagement with computer emergency response teams globally. On a daily basis, we work cert to cert across the globe. And it's not just an analyst-to-analyst exchange, but we also have 12 partners that are hooked up to our automated indicator sharing platform, the automated pushing back and forth of indicators of compromise. These are the sorts of engagements that build trust, that build partnerships, that operationalize partnerships. What does that lead to ultimately? Well, my team deploys incident response capabilities, technical assessment globally. It's not just Europe, it's South America, it's Asia, it's all over the world. We're there, we're partners. When the call comes in, we're standing ready to ask, and we can deploy anywhere on very short order, not just domestically, but globally. So as we continue to think through what the evolution of DHS cybersecurity capabilities are, it's beyond information sharing. Information sharing is the minimum bar. We have to get beyond information sharing, even beyond information exchange, and we have to focus on operationalizing cybersecurity, operationalizing partnerships. So how are we doing that? Well, a couple ways, but to start with, we're evolving the way we're thinking about risk. We're moving beyond a 16-sector model where it's just the energy sector we're concerned about or just the financial services sector. What we're trying to do is, as the artificialities of the economic argument that 16 sectors exists here, as those dissolve because of the cross-cutting relationships, the ICT underpinnings of these sectors, what we're finding is that more than anything, the sameness of the attack surface far outweighs any of the uniqueness of the sector. And what does that really mean? It's that we're all running on business systems. In the hard infrastructure space, they're all running on operational technology. And they're only, particularly in the OT space, there are only so many companies and organizations that are playing in that space with very stylized and tailored deployments at the edge. So it's critically important that we work together and share information and work to understand what the real risk is across those sectors. So as these 16 sectors kind of fall away and we're looking at functions, we're trying to get to a better, more systemic understanding of risk. What are those things that actually matter? What are those things that if interrupted at the literal end of the day, the economy would crater? How do we identify those things? So last summer up in New York City, Secretary Nielsen launched the National Risk Management Center within my agency that is that cross-cutting across the federal government, but also cross-cutting across industry and the international community to identify those national critical functions, those things that are so systemically important that they have to continue on a daily, weekly, or monthly basis. That should roll out next week, but we're in the process of finalizing, and we're looking at about 57 national critical functions. Sounds like a lot. How are 57 things critical? Well, when you scatter 57 things across 16 sectors, it's actually becomes pretty apparent what we're trying to accomplish here. Again, What are those 4 or 5 things out of the financial services sector? What are those 4 or 5 things out of the energy sector that really, truly matter? And it's not necessarily paying the bill every month, but it's ensuring that we can transport fuel for baseload generation purposes to generate electricity. So it's stitching these things together and characterizing where the true risk is. Now, what that's going to do for us is when we get an understanding that an adversary has developed a capability to manipulate industrial control systems, what we're able to do is take that and cascade it across the critical functions and say, here are 23, I'm making that number up right now, 23 critical functions that could be held at risk because they've developed this capability within industrial control systems. But what's also coming to light as we try to evolve our understanding of risk is that, my gosh, we have a whole lot of work to do to really understand risk. And nowhere is that more important than supply chain risk management. I've talked a little bit about this lately, but we've got to be able to parse out what we're worried about more clearly in terms of our supply chain risk management efforts. It's about sharing information about risk and where the threat is. I think the best manifestation of this concept was in 2017 when Acting Secretary Duke issued a binding operational directive that required federal civilian agencies to remove Kaspersky Labs antivirus products from their networks. This is something that was the worst kept secret in town, maybe, but nonetheless, the issue was that we had a company that had a product that was basically a rootkit, that was operating below a level we typically monitor, scraping information, hypothetically sending back to Moscow, that would then be subject to the military intelligence services of a nation state that has demonstrated ill will against the United States. So breaking this down into a framework allows us to really get a overly simplified, perhaps, but decent understanding of the way we can tackle this problem together. And that's, what is the thing? What's the thing? What is the product, the service, the solution, whatever? Where does it go? What does it have access to? What can it take? And then ultimately, who controls it? Who has ultimate authority over the access in the root level in the case of Kaspersky? And so Kaspersky was easy. It was antivirus, potentially sending information back to Moscow that could then be privy to the GRU, the FSB, SVR, you keep going. Because of the system of laws that an authoritarian state had implemented. So what really is this? This is weaponizing and operationalizing the tech sector. It's a pretty simple framework that we're going to continue to deploy across other sectors and other segments of the information and communications technology sectors. We can look at any country, any framework, any product through this lens, and it gives us a pretty good understanding of the things that we think we can tolerate and we can't. My authorities, though, are limited, in this case, to the federal civilian agencies. But if I've learned anything over the last 2 years, is when the Department of Homeland Security, when the federal government speaks and takes action, others listen. The private sector listens. State and local governments listen. Our partners in the international community want to work with us on these things. So in some cases, I've used this before, but it's the Spider-Man problem. With great power comes great responsibility. So we've got to be dead solid perfect every time. But we've got enough of an understanding, we have the authorities to engage and work with not just industry, but the intelligence community and law enforcement to get the job done to protect services on behalf of the American people, but also our allies and partners. Relatedly, election security. So I told you I'd come back to this. Election security is one of those things that I swear when I came in 2 years ago, I did not think I would be as engaged and travel as much international or global, domestically as I found myself in the run-up to 2018. I did not think that secretaries of state would have my phone number and would text me at all hours of the day and the night. But it happened, and I'm about to get a little blue here. I'm very glad that we were able to engage and help out the state and local community to the extent we did in 2018. I think Matt Masterson's, if he hasn't already talked today, but that guy is a national hero. Wherever he is, he put more time into supporting state and local governments on my team than I think, well, let's put it this way, I owe that guy a bunch of beers. So what we're doing right now, what we were able to do for 18 was work with all 50 states and over 1,400 local communities, local jurisdictions in the run-up to 18. But the challenge here is that there are 8,800 jurisdictions domestically. So we've got to figure out how to scale up to 8,800. We're going to continue to share information about the threat. We're going to continue to provide technical services, and we're going to continue to work on training, exercise, and other things. But this is not just a United States problem. This is a global problem. We continue to see Russia, we continue to see other countries engage in influencing and trying to interfere in elections. What I'm doing in the run-up to 2020, and perhaps General Hawke will talk about this a little bit later, but we are trying to understand what the adversary, in this case Russia, is doing elsewhere, in Eastern Europe, in Ukraine, in other parts of the world, so that we can get inside their decision loop, so that we can understand what tools they're trying to develop. Sometimes they might not think we're watching or listening. Oh, but we are. And so I want to be able to take that understanding of tool sets and capabilities that they're road testing somewhere else, and I want to be able to bring that back here and help harden infrastructure and help take those avenues off the table. But it's also incumbent upon me, given we've got a track record of experience with election interference from the Russians, I need to be able to push that out and help my partners in Europe and elsewhere is they get ready for elections, whether it's EU parliamentary elections, snap elections, or otherwise. So we've got a lot of work to do, but if anything, if anyone in this room can agree on one thing, it's we need to protect democracy. And that for this room, for us, we're going to protect 2020. So that was my call when I was out at the RSA conference a couple weeks ago, or month or whatever it was. We are going to focus, and we're going to continue to focus on 2020, but we're ultimately focused on protecting democracy worldwide. And so I ask everybody in this room, whether it's here in the US or elsewhere, you can be part of this team. You can be part of this fight too. Engage, volunteer, participate, preach, whatever it is. We've got a job to do. There's no business motive here. It's protecting democracy, and if there's anything worth fighting for, it's probably that. So I know when to stop. So I'm going to stop on that. So I think we've got a few minutes of Q&A. I think Catherine's around here somewhere. No? Okay, that's right. She already told you how to do Q&A. Mics are open. Any questions? Come on. Oh, can we get a mic over here? And I apologize,
Thank you.
It's a little bright. I see some familiar faces. But
I'm a retired Senior Colonel Shu Weidi from China.
Yes, sir.
So I have two points. I'm not quite sure if I understand correctly. First one, you mentioned China did cyber attack on U.S. National critical infrastructure. I wonder, could you go further about that? Secondly, if my understanding is correctly, seems you want to kick China totally outside supply chain. Is that correct?
So let me start with your second point. I think what's going on right now, particularly domestically, but this is an international problem. I think, in an international economy, in a global economy, you have to look at all players through a certain lens, but certainly in the case of China, I think it's a market. There's no question it's a market, and people are going to chase the almighty dollar. They're also a partner from a supply chain perspective, whether it's manufacturing, designing, whatever. And then the third is, you know what? To answer your first question, Department of Justice indictment, I think Adam Hickey was here earlier, very clear in those indictments that nation-state actors, the Chinese state cyber actors, infiltrated U.S. domestic infrastructure for intellectual property theft. So what we have is a process where we have to balance critical infrastructure, domestic infrastructure has to balance risk and reward. If you want to go into this market, you have to be very transparent and eye-open. There's a series of laws in place, whether it's the cybersecurity law, the intelligence law. Ultimately, this is a country that has identified very clearly where they want to go in their Made in China 2025 plan of the strategic sectors that they want to invest in and be market players in. If you're a domestic infrastructure, if you're a U.S. company, if you're any company that plays in any of those strategic sectors, you have a target on you. Manage risk accordingly. Any other questions?
In the
Yep.
In the Washington Post and New York Times, in the past couple of months, have been articles about the threat posed by principally students from the PRC at American universities. And of course, the universities of the United States are very, very dependent on grad students abroad. And I'm wondering what type of concrete programs are sort of addressing this issue, at least thinking about this issue.
Yeah, so the Department of Justice and the intelligence community, the Director of National Intelligence, has been pretty out in front on this, engaging state and local partners. The way I look at it from the Cyber and Infrastructure Security Agency perspective is I want to be able to work with universities and their leadership, their boards, their rectors, whatever, and their chief information security officers to take the same approach that we're taking in the federal government that any sophisticated information security officer would take to understand what risk looks like. So from my perspective, it's R&D, federal R&D grants. It's private sector partnerships for R&D. Where does that information reside on the networks? Who has access to it? Just taking a high-value asset approach is one that can really start protecting the critical infrastructure, the information, the intellectual property that's being developed across colleges and universities, but ultimately understanding that the pure ethos of the American education system is one of openness, collaboration, but at some point, there has to be a recognition that there is research being conducted that is sensitive, that is funded by the Department of Defense, that is funded by the Department of Energy, that is funded by DHS, and there needs to be certain protections and controls put around that information. So what we've got to be able to do is provide that information security toolkit or chief information security officer in a box to help colleges and universities ensure that whatever that data is, it's protected where it resides. Yes, ma'am.
My name is Liisa Past. I'm Estonian, and I do, amongst other things, election security. I couldn't agree more than with what you've ended up with. No, we need to share, and we need to share on a very practical level. However, what I've seen in my international work is that everyone agrees, but no one shows theirs first unless they see others first. To what degree would you be willing to share meaningful technical American information in real time or close to real time first, even if that means that, amongst allies, that allies would have understanding of your systems and configurations that not the public doesn't internationally.
Okay, so I think that the real rub here is that it doesn't matter what country you're in, every election system's different. I probably wouldn't wish the status or state of technology in the United States right now on anybody, but there is a whole lot of investment that has to happen in the U.S. to retire some of these legacy systems that are potentially vulnerable. From a information sharing perspective, particularly my team and what we do on risk assessments and understanding of where the risk resides within the election infrastructure, we tend to work as much as possible at the unclassified level, and so there should be very little barrier to entry in terms of sharing that. The intelligence community, that information sharing, that's obviously a more complicated conversation, but I think what we're seeing, particularly over the last 2 years, is an increased willingness and a quicker declassification or a quicker sharing timeline than probably has ever been in history of at least the intelligence community. So there's always going to be work to do here, but things are getting better, things are getting faster.
Hi, my name's Charles Yarborough. I'm a student at JHU. I have two questions, very interrelated. First thing is regarding hardware. There are a lot of hardware that's made overseas, particularly China, and some of them may have backdoors or other access points for foreign intelligence. The second is the NSA, and other agencies are known to collect 0 days and hold on to them if necessary. Do you continue to do so to increase cooperation on security, or do you plan to keep storing essential 0 days?
So let me answer your first question first on hardware vulnerabilities. Look, I think supply chain in general is, as I mentioned, it's a thorny issue. It's really complicated to manage, but I think if we're talking about where the vulnerabilities are most likely to reside, it's probably in the software side rather than the hardware side. It just scales better, and it's not the smoking gun of the hardware side. But the key here is transparency in the process, transparency in the ownership of a company, transparency and control of a company, transparency in the process of testing and certification, so on and so forth. So it's what are those indicators of trust and transparency? On the 0 day side, look, we as the United States government have a vulnerability equities process and a disclosure program that, as far as I know, is the first really transparent process out there. I came from a company that's actually benefited probably from the intelligence community and others finding bad things and being provided that information to actually protect. So my sense of things is particularly when it comes to me and my agency, we are the advocate for the critical infrastructure community. We are the advocate for the private sector. So when these conversations happen about, well, there's this vulnerability, what do we do with it? I'm always going to be pushing to, hey, let's protect the ecosystem. One of those things that happened earlier this year was we issued an emergency directive, and this wasn't anything to do with the U.S. government, but we pushed out an emergency directive because of an ongoing DNS tampering campaign. And ultimately, my position on the campaign was this is global fabric of the internet type stuff. We've got to get out there and push capabilities or a warning and the things you can do to protect yourself. So that's always going to be my approach to problems.
Thank you.
Thanks. All right.
One more question, I think. Last one, quick.
No. Catherine's given me the no. So.
Sorry about that. You've got to stay on schedule. Sorry, Craig.
Thank you.
Thank you, Director. Thank you. So I'm sorry we have to stay on time, so think about your questions beforehand and run up to the mic and even get there earlier. I want to thank Director Krebs first, but now in preparation for our third plenary panel that'll focus on military and intelligence activities in cyberspace, I'd like to welcome Brigadier General Timothy Hawke, the commander of the Cyber National Mission Force at the U.S. Cyber Command. As commander of the Cyber National Mission Force, Brigadier General Hawke serves as the Defend the Nation lead for the commander of U.S. Cyber Command. He coordinates the prevention and response to cyber incidents and campaigns perpetrated by threat actors in order to preserve U.S.'s critical infrastructure and key resources. He most recently served as the U.S. Cyber Command Director of Intelligence. Prior to that, he was the Deputy Commander of Joint Task Force Ares, executing U.S. Cyber Command's counter-ISIS campaign. He also served as the commander of the 480th Intelligence, Surveillance, and Reconnaissance Wing, responsible for approximately 6,000 military, civilian, and contractor personnel, and a total enterprise valued at more than $5 billion. Please welcome General Hawke to the stage.
Thank you, Catherine. It's an honor to follow Director Krebs, who's been such a great leader in this space and has also been a great teammate to U.S. Cyber Command in his role as Director of CISA. Everyone, thank you very much. I'm excited to be here and represent United States Cyber Command, and more specifically the Cyber National Mission Force today, as we talk through what is the role of the military in cyberspace. So what I hope to do today is lay out a bit of a challenge in terms of changing perceptions as to what we view that role is of the military in cyberspace. And I'll take some questions at the end, but I ask you to hold all the really hard questions for the group that follows me, including Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense Wilson, who drives all of our policy very expertly. So one of the three things that I'd like to cover is in relation to what has occurred over the last year. So it's been a very significant year for United States Cyber Command as we approach our one-year anniversary of elevation to become a full combatant command. In that year, there's been an increase in clarity in a number of key areas. One of those is the nation's strategy, is how we're approaching cyberspace, and then specifically DoD's role, which I'll talk about in terms of where we fit in the DoD cyber strategy, but also an alignment in the law and changes that have occurred over the last year based off of Congress that really align the strategy that we're executing within the executive branch, within the legal framework that has been established by Congress. And then finally, I'll give you our operational approach, how General Nakasone, as the commander of United States Cyber Command, has articulated his overarching operational approach as persistent engagement. I'll talk to you about how we are putting our individual campaigns together in terms of the operational organization of each of those to be able to meet his intent and vision aligned to the DoD cyber strategy. So to outline the significant changes in strategy over the last year, in 2017, the administration published both the National Security Strategy and the National Cyber Strategy. In 2018, the Department of Defense took major steps in terms of the publishing of the National Defense Strategy, which outlined the focus on great power competition, specifically discussing both China and Russia, as well as the intent to be able to increase the lethality of our force and build and grow partnerships and be able to reform our acquisition system to ensure that we're able to meet the demands of the current great power competition. To define the role of cyber, the Secretary of Defense then published the cyber strategy, which for us in U.S. Cyber Command as the operational force and the lead element has a major impact on how we've structured our force and organized our force to be able to meet the expectations. It identified 5 key objectives. Ensure that the joint force can achieve its missions in contested cyberspace environment. That means fight our nation's wars and be able to deliver cyberspace capabilities as part of any multi-domain effort that's underway. Strengthen the joint force by conducting cyberspace operations that enhance U.S. military advantages. This is both defensive and offense. How can we ensure that our data can reach the right place for information advantage? Be able to defend U.S. critical infrastructure from malicious cyber activity that alone or as part of a campaign could cause a significant cyber incident. This is really where our partnership with Homeland Security has been focused. How do we, as a Department of Defense, bring our weight and capacity to be able to ensure that we are in full support of the Secretary of Homeland Security if our nations and any part of our critical infrastructure is under attack? And I'll talk more about that today. How do we secure our own systems to ensure that we're able to successfully operate in any contested environment? And how do we expand DoD cyber cooperation with interagency, industry, and international partners? As you heard from Director Krebs, the ability to partner across all of the elements within cyberspace is a critical enabler for all of us. Whether that be an international partner that faces the same threats to democracy, whether that's an industry partner that is a critical enabler for any critical infrastructure segment defense, or it's another U.S. government element that has a like mission that needs to be able to have the right information or the right capability to be successful. We've seen a significant progress based off of the shift in that strategy, which has allowed us to begin to align the force. General Nakasone speaks very proudly of the fact that now we are a fully operational capable force that has an ability to be able to conduct a full spectrum operations in defense and offense, and we have been successful in doing that with our interagency, international, and industry partners. While those changes had occurred in the strategy for the department, there were also some significant things that occurred within changes to the law that really sent a very clear signal from Congress as its expectations for the Department of Defense. And I'll just highlight a couple of those. There were a number of them in the National Defense Authorization Act for 2019, but I'll just highlight three. The first was an update to the law that affirmed the authority of the Secretary of Defense to conduct military activities and operations in cyberspace. Clearly articulated an expectation for the Department of Defense to use its capability to compete with adversaries that were operating outside of international norms. That allowed us as a department to begin to organize and resource in partnership with the other combatant commands. The second was a clear articulation of the desire from Congress for the department to be part of the interagency activities that conduct active defense against Russian malign activities, the People's Republic of China, DPRK, and Iran, where they are conducting attacks in cyberspace outside of international norms. Congress gave clear authority to the president to give that authorization to the department to be able to conduct those activities. And finally, in terms of the focus on the critical infrastructure, Congress authorized the Department of Defense a pilot program to be able to enhance cybersecurity and resiliency as part of critical infrastructure, specifically giving the Secretary of Defense the authority to deploy 50 military personnel to work with the Department of Homeland Security under the department's expense to be able to better defend critical infrastructure in terms of the capacity and technical capability that the department can bring for areas that DHS requests our assistance. This took away a critical challenge for us that in the past, if DHS needed our assistance, we had to go through a pretty complex process to be able to provide that assistance that also required DHS to fund DoD's activities. That's no longer the case. We have the ability up to 50 personnel to be able to now really rapidly respond if DHS has a call. We can bring more mass through the previous process, but now we can move much more quickly in partnership with CISA as needed. So taking those two things, the strategy and the changes in the law, General Nakasone articulated an operational approach called persistent engagement. And that was really to establish how we would, as a Department of Defense, be able to compete with those adversaries that were conducting activities that were in threat to our national interest, and also into the national interests of our allies. So those activities below the level of armed conflict. And what he charged all of his components to do was to begin to be very focused on who are our partners. And it really is defined in two key areas. How do we enable our partners' activities? And then how do we prepare to act, if called upon by our nation, to stop any adversary activity? He describes that 2/3 enable, 1/3 act. And those are areas that we have now seen as an approach that allows us to be really good partners, particularly with our domestic agencies, whether that be the FBI or DHS, to be able to enable their actions to be able to stop adversaries and their actions that would impact U.S. interest. As Director Krebs identified, one of those areas that General Nakasone has talked about is our partnership as U.S. Cyber Command with DHS and FBI as part of the midterm elections. I think everyone in U.S. Cyber Command, the National Security Agency, are very proud of the support that we provided to the Department of Homeland Security and view that as a critical example as to how we approach persistent engagement. In this case, wherever we could bring any additional information that would allow DHS to meet its assigned mission or FBI its ability to meet its task and malign influence as part of the broader interagency team. So what I really would like to emphasize is the idea that what we are focused on in terms of military activities in cyberspace is not necessarily the department's outcome. It's not about what the Department of Defense's role is. It's how can we enable our international partners, our domestic partners in industry to be able to defend those things that are critical to our nation's success. As we've done that, I'll give you some examples of outcomes that in the past may not have been considered things that we would have looked at as a department as measures of our effectiveness. But today we can look at it and say, if the Department of State issues a demarche based off of information that the Department of Defense has provided, that is an outcome that's positive for our nation. If DHS can issue an alert that goes to industry based off of information that is derived from our operations, that's a success for the Department of Defense. Whether it's Treasury sanctions, whether it is the Department of Energy being able to communicate directly through the Energy ISAC back to all of its member firms, threats to that sector, that is an outcome from the Department of Defense that we are seeking to achieve, and being able to use our resources to do that. As we look at how we've approached the overall for persistent engagement, I just want to give you a sense as to how we're organizing our operational activities, particularly within the Cyber National Mission Force. So our mission is focused on malicious cyber actors that are outlined in the National Defense Strategy and the DoD Cyber Strategy. And the way that we have organized our operational activities is across three lines of effort. The first line of effort is focused on gaining insights into adversary activities. Being able, through the course of our operations and our partnerships, to be able to get a better understanding of what our adversaries are targeting, in particularly any targeting of critical infrastructure in the United States. Foundation to us for this line of effort is our partnership with the National Security Agency, who's our closest and enduring partner in terms of understanding what's occurring in the battle space that we operate in. Based off those foundational insights, our focus is on being able to enable our partners and to enable defense. So we spend a significant portion of each of our task force's time identifying who are the most critical partners based off of either the critical infrastructure segments or in relation to adversary activity and what is being targeted within the United States or within our allies. As an example of this, as Director Krebs alluded to, we have moved towards the Defend Forward model, actually moving off of our Department of Defense networks and partnering with various nations to be able to hunt for adversary activity on their networks. We've announced those publicly as to what we've done in the past, and we continue to do those. The intent for that is to challenge our adversaries wherever they are, and to be able to gain insights from how they are targeting the critical processes of our allies and our partners, to be able to bring that information back and be able to disclose that to DHS and FBI in terms of critical infrastructure and law enforcement, as well as directly to industry. We have begun an initiative that if we discover malware as part of our ongoing Cyber Command operations, we have begun disclosing that malware on global cybersecurity forums so that we could pass that information directly to industry to allow industry to be able to generate countermeasures more quickly. That's an area we want to continue to explore as to what is the right role for the department in terms of our relationships with industry, how we pass information in the most agile and quickest manner to be able to put additional pressure on adversaries that are targeting our critical infrastructure. We see those international partnerships continuing to grow. We see them particularly in areas where nations are looking for assistance, and we are partnering both with our geographic combatant command teammates, DHS, as well as very closely with the Department of State to be able to enable that. Additionally, our final area that in terms of our line of effort is to be prepared to act, to be able to impose a cost. That cost could come in terms of any of those other areas that I described. It could be through enabling state, it could be enabling treasury, and we now have use cases and examples of where we've been very successful at doing that with each of our partners. At other times, it's going to be how we pass information to our international partners to allow them to have an outcome. We look forward in each of these situations to be able to build these partnerships, both within the U.S. government, with our international partners, and with industry, so that as U.S. Cyber Command and the role that DoD has articulated, and how we will be a partner in terms of defending critical infrastructure, being prepared to impose costs, and then if our nation calls upon us in times of conflict, to be able to provide multi-domain outcomes as part of an overall strategy for our nation. So what I would like to leave you with today, before taking questions, is as you think about United States Cyber Command and the role that we will play going forward, think of us as a teammate, think of us as a close partner, and someone that is most interested in defending the critical infrastructure of our United States, being able to do that as a good partner and to be able to ensure that at every step along the way, we are in very close compliance with international norms, our laws, and our values in every operation that we conduct. I stand by for any questions and look forward to continuing the conversation.
Hi, my name is Rosemary Aviano. I'm a research assistant at the National Security Archive for their Cyber Vault project, and I was wondering if you could speak to how persistent engagement is a part of the cyber deterrence strategy. Thank you.
So what we view, persistent engagement is really complementary from a cyber deterrence perspective. It is about competing in space that we have not competed previously from a Department of Defense standpoint. In terms of that precondition of how that both Congress, the overall national security strategy, and the national defense strategy has now set an expectation that the Department of Defense will engage through constant contact with our adversaries is a step for us to now be able to contest those adversaries in ways that we haven't in the past. We have not previously imposed costs in that space, and we will be prepared to move across the conflict continuum as the nation calls upon the Department of Defense. But we see those as very complementary in the long run.
Hi, Mark Pomerleau with Fifth Domain. You mentioned some of the authorities that Congress gave you in the last NDAA. There's also been some authorities that have been provided by the executive. With the NDAA season rapidly coming upon us, are there any authorities or tweaks from an operational perspective that you're looking for from Congress that you've engaged with them to try to maybe amend or provide in addition to what they did last year?
So that's from a change in law, as a tactical commander, that's an area that really exceeds what I'm normally involved in. I can say what I think we have done is really between the Department of Defense had a very good engagement with Congress in terms of ensuring that they're getting routine updates as to what the department's activities have been, and allows them to also then ensure that their oversight responsibilities have been met and that we are meeting the intent of those changes in law. I will expect that the department will continue to have refinements, but that's not an area that I routinely am involved in. Thanks, Mark.
Hi, my name is Neil Hussein, data manager with CWA. I was curious, seeing that we're speaking at an educational institution, when you're looking at recruits, are there particular backgrounds that you're looking for coming in, skills that you're in particular need of that people should keep in mind? Are there particular certifications that you make sure that people who are joining your team are acquiring once they're on it? Thank you very much.
Oh, it's a great question. So in terms of the type of individuals that we're looking for, particularly within the department, it starts all the way from an 18-year-old out of high school to a PhD that will fill one of our more senior roles as a senior civilian. So we have need for that across that entire spectrum of talent. From someone that's coming in out of high school, what we're really looking for is passion and desire about cyber in general, and that really is a nice starting area where we've now, within our recruitment process, have begun to assess that type of interest early, and people that have talent to be able to work them through a series of certifications. Our foundational certifications mirror those within industry, whether that's Security Plus and Net Plus, A Plus in terms of standard cybersecurity certifications. But then once they join our force, depending on the work role that they're in, we'll give them very tailored training. So that's an enlisted recruit, as they join our force, will then go through a series of training to ensure that they meet every standard in terms of being able to comply with whether that be our legal regimes or the expectations to be able to conduct an operation. In terms of our officers, that is a mix of skills and talents, whether that's individuals coming from the service cyber academies that have really grown over the last 5 years in terms of computer science expertise. So bringing them in primarily to be leaders, operators, and planners versus, or also tool developers as part of our team. And then civilians, we have been given the authority to do cyber accepted service, which allows us to bring talent from industry in a much more direct way. And that's an area for us that allows us, when we get after the types of things in terms of reform, cyber acquisition, and those areas, bringing in talent directly from industry. We've now been enabled to do that, to be able to leverage industry expertise, as well as taking individuals that are coming out of master's programs that we can also work to fund their continuing education or their student loans to be able to put them in a more senior position as either a senior planner, acquisition expert, or intelligence professional focused on cyberspace. Great question.
Yes, sir.
Dan Freed with the Atlantic Council, used to be a State Department veteran. The Washington Post reported that U.S. Cyber Command paid a virtual visit on the Internet Research Agency, the St. Petersburg troll farm, letting them know that you were keeping your eye on them. Personally, I thought that was a really cool thing to do. Can you confirm this? And beyond this one reported incident, does this fit inside your spectrum of possible actions? That is, letting a potential or an actual cyber adversary know that we have eyes on?
So in terms of any confirmation of any specific operation, that's outside the policy of the department. I think more broadly, what the nation expects of the Department of Defense is to be prepared to take actions when called upon. And I think those are areas that General Nakasone has talked about. We have seen that all the way from Ambassador Bolton to the Secretary of Defense to General Nakasone have described what the expectation is, that if we're called upon to defend the critical infrastructure of the United States, we'll be ready to do that. And that's an area that we spend a significant amount of time to be both exercising, to be working with our partners, and also to work really closely with our interagency colleagues to make sure if there is an action that we ever anticipate taking, that we do that really transparently, both with our international teammates as well as with our interagency colleagues.
Well-crafted answer, thank you.
Awesome. Well, we look forward to the next panel. I'll turn it back over to Catherine. Again, really honored to be here today to represent U.S. Cyber Command, and hope all of you are really well postured to celebrate our one-year birthday as being Combatant Command on May 4th. Thank you all very much.
Good afternoon. That was a terrific presentation. I'm Frank Kramer. I'll moderate this